German Climate Pavilion at COP29 in Baku. Germany. Climate solutions, fast and fair.
Hello, everybody, and a good afternoon here from Baku, and a good afternoon to our viewers and to our audience in the live stream. Also, of course, to our guests in China. Thanks for making time in your calendar. To our guests in Germany, Central Europe, a very early good morning to you. And of course, to all of you again, thanks again for making space in your busy COP29 calendars. It's a real pleasure to have you here in the German Climate Pavilion. And a lot is debated here on COP in Baku, but we've also debated a lot about our topic of today on the COP in Cali, because today is the COP Day of Nature and Biodiversity. And the global community now, while being here on COP in Baku, is also preparing for INC-5, right? The 5th session of the Intergovernmental Negotiating Committee to negotiate a legally binding international plastics treaty. And that is especially our topic of today, with the question on how can resource efficiency and circular economy principles contribute to achieving the global sustainability and climate goals. What are the strategies that we need on that journey forward? What are the obstacles? What's holding us back? But what are also the solutions and the front runners in that? While a lot of people are already traveling to the INC-5 next week in Busan, South Korea, we are here now setting also the scene in Baku in Azerbaijan, so thanks again for joining. And you might have known, of course, by seeing the program that we will have different guests here on stage, so please be aware that you need a translation device if you're not fluent in English or Chinese. We do have translation devices still on site. Is there anyone still in need? Hands up. Yes, we will have 2 or 3 more on standby for you. Wonderful. So our team from the pavilion will give you the translation devices in a minute. All right, so for that, I welcome you once again. But for the official welcome, I introduce you now to the Federal Minister for Environment, Nature, Conservation, Nuclear Safety and Consumer Protection of Germany. Please give her a round of applause. Steffi Lemke.
Participants, colleagues, guests, it gives me great pleasure to welcome you to this side event here in the German Pavilion. Today we are talking about how to end plastic pollution in our environment and oceans, and how the climate can benefit. Did you know that plastic life cycle, from production to disposal, accounts for around 4% of global greenhouse gas emissions? This figure is almost as high as emissions from global aviation and shipping. The vast majority of these emissions stem from the production of plastics. Plastic production could double or even triple by the middle of the century. This means that emissions will continue to rise. In other words, if we continue to produce, use and throw away plastic at this rate, we will not reach our climate goals. It's impossible. We must reduce plastic production quickly and significantly. The answer is not to simply replace single-use plastics with other single-use products like those made of paper. Paper production also requires a lot of energy and valuable wood. The solution is less packaging and, more importantly, reusable packaging. This reduces waste and saves valuable resources. The INC negotiations for a global plastic agreement are now entering a crucial phase. The German government is committed to ending plastic pollution by 2040. To achieve this goal, it is essential that the new agreement also addresses and reduces plastic production. It is time for us to lower our resource consumption. This is because the extraction and use of raw materials uses a lot of water and destroys plants, animals, and habitats. They cause enormous greenhouse gas emissions. And this is why circular economy must also play a greater role in efforts to combat climate change. I would like to see two specific aspects included in the decisions here in Baku. First, more circular economy measures should be included in the NDCs. And second, we should clearly state the link between plastic production and the climate crisis. This would send an important message in the run-up to INC-5. In Germany, we have been able to continuously increase resource efficiency. However, per capita raw material consumption is still far too high. Germany's goal is to reduce the consumption of primary raw materials and close material cycles. This is why we launched a national circular economy strategy. It sets ambitious new targets and outlines a number of measures. The environment and climate, as well as our economy, will benefit greatly from these measures. Our strategy is also designed to support the global transition to a circular economy. For example, through bilateral cooperation with our partners around the world, such as the Sino-German dialogue on circular economy and resource efficiency. I firmly believe that the new European Commission will continue to work towards advancing circular economy. Some important instruments for this are already in place. For example, the European Ecodesign for Sustainable Products Regulation. It defines requirements for the environmentally friendly design of different products, such as clothing and furniture, household appliance and IT. Another example is the European Battery Regulation. It lays the foundation for new batteries to be more often made from resources obtained from used batteries. This is how circular economy can be put into practice in more and more areas. Resource conservation and circular economy, climate action and environmental protection. These issues all go hand in hand. We can only effectively protect the environment and mitigate climate change if we recognize and make use of the many links. Let's work together to find solutions and safeguard our future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Her Excellency, for setting the scene now for our first panel round in a second, but also of two thematic inputs. And for that, I welcome now, joining us virtually, the co-chair of the International Resource Panel and partner at Systemic, with his grand expertise in environmental impacts and sustainability, Janez Potočnik. I hope you can hear me, Janez, and greetings from Baku.
I'm hearing you well.
Hi, Janez. All right.
Hi.
The stage is all yours, and we are thrilled to hear what you brought us.
Thank you. Dear Minister Lemke, friends, good morning to all from Brussels. I will try to point my short intervention to the importance of resource management, circular economy, and put it into a kind of context which is based on the Global Resource Outlook, which we have as IRP released at the beginning of this year. Only one slide will be devoted to plastic, but practically all will be pointing into direction which you set with your logo, fast and fair, impacting on the climate solutions. One of the conclusions of our report is that the economy championed by industrialized nations is wasteful and unjust. Thus, we have to shift from the prevailing resource wasteful economic approach because it's ethically and ecologically unsustainable. We must set the order right. Economy was invented, as you know, to serve humans and our needs, and not the opposite. According to GRO, material use has increased in the last 50 years for more than threefold. Majority of that can be linked to the increase of the non-metallic minerals, which is easy to explain, because this is building of the cities, building of infrastructure in fast economically growing parts of the world, which also contain a bulk of the world population. High-income countries use 6 times more materials per capita and are responsible for 10 times per capita climate impacts. Middle-income countries are really growing fast in the recent years, and the tragic news is that low-income countries remain comparatively low and mostly in unchanged position. Our research is giving a clear recognition that extraction and processing of materials is the reason for, could explain 60% of global climate change impacts, 40% of air pollution health impacts, and more than 90% of water stress and also land-related biodiversity loss. When it comes to the impacts, we see that majority are basically connected, both of the good things are connected to the global north, and the impacts are mainly connected to the global south. What are the core policy recommendations which we are giving? First, decoupling of well-being growth from the economic growth and altogether from the resource use, and of course, everything from the environmental impacts. We need to look through the natural resource use, through the provisioning systems, and attribute to that the most important policy recommendations, which in our context have been institutionalized resource governance and define resource use path, which is basically setting resource targets, directing finance towards sustainable resource use, making trade an engine of sustainable resource use, mainstreaming sustainable consumption options, and finally creating circular, resource-efficient and low-impact solutions and business models. So we, as two co-chairs who are leading the International Resource Panel in our personal capacity, we are trying to push this agenda further. So we are calling for establishing a kind of a task force for global material governance, which would discuss about few major issues. One is how to provide better orientation, so science-based guidance on global and national material use targets. Second, how to provide better measurement indicators measuring material use against the performance of the provisioning systems. And third, better economic incentives, incorporating externalities into pricing mechanisms. This is one of the core problems also when it comes to the things which we are discussing today. Circular economy, it's simply not economically attractive, and that is the serious problem. And the last thing, we don't have really a good governance on a global level. Somebody who would provide us with better data, with better analysis, something which would be a kind of international energy agency for materials, if you want. So I think it's really important, and this is the core role of our governments. Don't waste time chasing butterflies, mend your garden and the butterflies will come. Industry needs clear agreed strategic direction. It needs predictability, support for the agreed travel direction, and as good level playing field as it gets, all based on a clear vision designed by policymakers, based of course on science and also on the public interest. So if I would on one slide try to explain you how the logic of policy making should look like. We should all start from human needs, which are in the inner part of the circle of the donut developed by Keith Robert. Then take into account the planetary boundaries. Ask yourself, which are the most resource-intensive provisioning systems? And IRP research, it's telling us that 4 of them are more than 90% of all material use: food, built environment, mobility, and energy. And then try to design the policy not in silos, but like you would be solving the Rubik Cube. So it's not enough if you mend one side and the other stay in chaos. But we have to take into account all the sides if we want to make fair and also deliver fast decisions. Circular economy, it's of course an instrument for delivering decoupling, which I was mentioning before. And in circular economy, as you all know very well, we have different levels of which are all important, but some are used more than the others. From the recovery, reuse, repair, refurbish, repurpose, recycle strategy to the one which was already mentioned by Minister Lemke, that is minimize product need through better system design, which is actually very much still missing also in our circular economy efforts. Climate change, you are talking a lot there in Baku about energy transition, which is terribly important. Also technological developments, which are again very important. But we need to be aware that the climate breakdown is a symptom of ecological overshoot, and material food and demand side are dangerously under-discussed. While we are talking about carbon emission, the overshoot highlights on the material usage, including fossil fuels, waste output, which is actually the result of the wasteful economic systems, and of course, growth of the human society, which has more than doubled in the last 50 years. So climate change can only be effectively addressed if we combine the supply side solutions, carbon management and energy transition, with the demand side solutions, everything linked to circular economy and decoupling, and of course, nature-based solutions, ecosystem services, and environmental sinks. So the thing which we are basically not looking enough is this. So we always talk, when we talk in particular about energy needs and then with that connected material needs of the future, we talk about extrapolating the current needs in the future. Instead, we would actually ask ourselves, how can we fix the baseline, which is today too high? And of course, then the solutions about the future needs would look very much differently. Our modeling is showing that that is possible. If you do the system transformations, you can basically mitigate the growth in material use by 30% and energy also by 25%. Just one slide about the plastic. My colleagues in Systemic have done a great work concerning that, and there are a few core recommendations coming. First, reduce virgin plastic production and consumption, very much in line with what I was explaining. Second, eliminate avoidable and problematic plastic and chemicals. Third, expand safe circularity via reuse, durability, and recycling. Fourth, provide controlled disposal of waste that cannot be prevented or safely recycled. And finally, some horizontal, prevent the use of microplastics and reduce microplastic releases into the environment. We will definitely talk about those things more in the panel debate. That's the last slide. My dear friends, we are indebting future generations, and we know that financially and by depleting the nature. And this is simply wrong. Apparently, we humans are the most intelligent species on the planet, and it's really high time to prove it. More than an economic or a technological choice, this is actually a moral choice. And by saying that, I would just like really to thank Germany and also Minister Lemke, because they have showed a real leadership in that area, leadership which is very much needed and very much welcomed. Thank you.
Thank you, Janez, and warm greetings, of course, from Baku to Brussels. Merci. Stay with us online, as you will be part of our conversation here on stage in a second as well. Ladies and gentlemen, now as a second speaker, I welcome the director and professor at the Institute for Circular Economy at the Tsinghua University. He has a high expertise in circular economy assessment, environmental impacts, and sustainability consumption. And he brought us a presentation on what Janez was just mentioning, how to support plastic pollution governance. So please also welcome him on stage, Dr. Bing Zhu.
I thank you, Ms. Moderator. Also thanks to the organizer for invitation. And also thanks to Janez, so very inspiring speech from perspective of resource efficiency. So Janez is a co-chair international resource panel. I myself a member of the panel. So as a researcher in resource efficiency, I have been deeply impressed by the G20 resource efficient dialogue initiated by Germany. So I have been to Berlin, I think twice, in 2017 to join the preparation workshop and also inaugural meeting of the dialogue. So nice to be here again in Germany. Today my topic is supporting plastic pollution governance with socio-economic metabolism analysis. I think we are here today for the upcoming INC-5 in Busan. As a scholar, I want to emphasize the importance of advancing scientific research for the global plastic treaty. This was highlighted in the non-paper by the INC chair. Specifically, so I'd like to stress the need for standardized approach for data connection and analysis. So one of the systemic approach is socio-economic metabolism analysis, a powerful tool to understand the production, use, and fate of plastics. Actually, Germany pioneered the study in 1998, examining historical plastic consumption, waste, and future scenarios. About 20 years later, this approach was applied to the global case. It is truly a journey from Germany to the world. So our team has studied the socio-economic metabolism of this plastic in big economies, focusing on China. In 2020, we analyzed the 5 commodity plastics, and currently a paper on 12 non-commodity plastics is now under review. We also collaborated on research led by Professor Ming Xu, our Tsinghua colleague, to review the global plastic data and also examine the metabolism in USA. These studies highlight significant differences in plastic metabolism patterns across countries. So I will share a case study on China to demonstrate how scientific research can support plastic pollution governance. This is our dynamic material flow model, covering over 95% of the plastic in China. It tracks plastic flows and also in-use stock from 1978 to 2022, covering production, manufacturing, use, disposal, and trade. The model includes 20 plastics, 11 product categories, 9 sectors, and 4 disposal methods. This Sankey diagram provides an overview of the socio-economic metabolism of plastic in China for 2022. Please note the part of this work is still under review. Based on the model, we can also obtain detailed data from production, consumption, to disposal. These results provide specific insights for per year, plastic type, sector, and disposal method. So I will present a zoom in of 2022 by this simplified diagram. Here we focus on 3 key stages: reproduction of polymers and plastic products, the flows and the stocks of plastics in society, and the disposal of plastic waste. In the production stage, plastics are often mistaken for their raw material, polymers. The two concepts are different. Not all polymers become plastic products. For example, PET and PU are widely used in non-plastic products like fibers and rubber. Our research on 20 plastics shows that 30% of total polymers are for non-plastic use. Without this distinction, plastic amounts could be overestimated by 60 million tons. Understanding the lifespan of plastic is essential for effective waste management. In China, long-term sectors such as construction and automotive account for 45% of plastic consumption. Plastics in these sectors remain as in-use stock for decades before being discarded. In contrast, the short-term sectors like packaging make up 39% and generate waste much more quickly. These differences highlight the need for policy attention targeted to specific patterns of plastic use. In the disposal stage, China leads the world in plastic recycling with a recycling rate about 30% and almost no plastic waste exports. However, there's still great potential to improve the plastic circular economy. Recycling rates vary widely by plastic types due to differences in properties and uses. This calls for tailored policy attention to enhance recycling for specific types of plastics. As I mentioned earlier, a large number of polymers are used in non-plastic products. This raises a critical scientific question. How do we define plastic? In the context of an international legally binding instrument, the definition is critical. It will determine the treaty's scope and lay the foundation for the compliance. However, this issue has not been fully discussed during INC-1 to INC-4, leaving for the 7 days in INC-5. To contribute, we worked with our polymer science colleagues at Tsinghua just this Monday, so we published a perspective in a leading Chinese journal. You are welcome to scan the QR code if you are interested in. So far, I have focused on science. As for supporting plastic pollution governance in my topic, so let me briefly introduce China's policy efforts. IRP recommends a multi-beneficial approach to policy making, aiming for innovation and system change. This includes national plans, policy mixes, policies for the circular economy, among others. In China, we have multi-level plans that address most of these elements. Currently, during the 14th five-year plan period, from 2021 to 2025, the national plan emphasizes improving the prevention and the control against plastic pollution throughout the whole chain. This is further detailed in the Circular Economy Development Plan, which calls for a special action involving 9 ministries. Lastly, there is a dedicated action plan for the plastic pollution governance. So our group is honored to provide some scientific support for these policy efforts. To summarize, I have 3 key take-home messages. First, socio-economic metabolism analysis provides scientific data for plastic pollution governance. Second, a scientifically grounded definition of plastic is a prerequisite for the treaty. Third, the socio-economic metabolism of plastic varies significantly between economies. So control measures and the means of implementation must consider national circumstances. This ends my presentation. Thank you all for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Zhu. Please join me here in our conversation round as we are... Join me here. Ladies and gentlemen, as we are quickly setting up the stage, yes, come on stage to my distinguished panelists. Have a seat here on the right, please. Thank you. As we are diving now more into what we've just heard, into the strategies, and also, of course, into the keywords that we'd like to elaborate a little bit further on. So Janez Potočnik has sent us, of course, some important messages from Brussels. He will be also joining us here on our panel. Also joined is, of course, here on the panel, Dr. Bing Zhu. Thank you again for your keywords. Martin Vogt will be also joining our panel, so please join us here on stage. Alexander Bonde, Nikki, Reisch, Liyang and Tsinghua. I'll do the introduction round in a second here on stage. Please come on stage. Yes. A warm welcome to you. Thank you. Everybody has a translation device in case we need, of course, the English-Chinese translation. I'll just do another quick round of introductions so that we understand who is actually on our stage. Again, Janez Potočnik joining us online, Dr. Bing Zhu is here on site. Martin Vogt is also joining us online. Dear Martin, greetings from Baku to Berlin. He's heading the Circular Economy, Resource Efficiency and Materials Department at the Association of German Engineers and the Technology Center in Berlin. All right, he's joining us, as I mentioned, online. Alexander Bonde is here on stage with us on my right-hand side. He's the Secretary General of the German Federal Environmental Foundation, Europe's largest environmental foundation, promoting environmental projects and managing over 7,000 hectares of conservation land. So we were looking forward to hear your perspective. We also have here on the left-hand side, Nikki Reisch. You're the Director of the Climate and Energy Program at CIEL, the Center for International Environmental Law. Again, thank you for making time in your busy calendar in these times at COP29. And you are leading a team of attorneys, campaigners, and researchers really pursuing strategic, legal, and policy efforts to address climate change, yes, and prioritizing also human rights. Thank you for being here. Liyang is with us, the president of China Association of Circular Economy and also a member of the 4th China National Expert Committee on Climate Change. Merci for being here. And last but absolutely not least, also here on stage, Tsinghua, the vice president of the Research Institute for Environmental Innovation in Tsinghua. Welcome, everybody. Beautiful. Let's talk about some barriers first before we come to solutions and opportunities and the way forward. So Martin, I'm looking I'm looking to you, joining us online. Bring us in with your industrial perspective. What would you see as a main barrier, or maybe as several main barriers, when it comes to integrating circular economy principles within the sector of plastic? And again, a little add-on question to that already tough question: how can, of course, industry stakeholders tackle these challenges and overcome the challenges? So a little SWOT analysis in 3 minutes.
Excellent. I hope you can hear me. And
yes.
That's excellent. Thank you very much. First of all, thank you for inviting me to the to this interesting and very distinguished panel. We are the VDI Technology Center, and within our center, we have the VDI Center for Research Efficiency, which supports small and medium-sized enterprises to increase their resource efficiency. So we have a very practical look on things. We have heard a lot of major principles. We have heard an excellent talk by Janez about the necessity to make the circular economy more competitive. At the moment, it isn't. And I want to just dive right into that analysis. First of all, when I look at general barriers for circular economy, we have conducted a study among 1,000 small and medium-sized enterprises in Germany across all industrial branches. And the first and foremost reason why companies do not embrace the circular economy is, of course, the possible impact of change in general on their product safety and their process stability in the industrial processes. So they are very adamant, they're very careful about implementing any changes. That is one of the main barriers we always face. That's why the Association of German Engineers is there, because we, of course, can support and give technical experience and advice. The second barriers the governments tell us are regulatory issues. Very often, for example, recycled content is not wanted. Also in public procurement, it's either excluded or it's directly excluded, or it's excluded by price, because a lot of times primary raw materials, Janez has already pointed to it, are much cheaper than recycled materials. So when I have public procurement and I only look at the price, most of the time the primary material always wins. The third one is the additional workload in the companies to implement circularity measures. Then a very important psychological component is the uncertainty of success, because every company has to survive and has to make a profit. And if they are not sure that their investments are actually successful, if the political framework, the regulatory framework, and the economic framework changes all the time, then of course investments are not made. And the last barrier, general barrier, is the lack of experienced workforce. There are of course also many drivers for circularity: cost cutting, regulatory requirements, enhancing competitiveness, and also customer requirements. More and more want CO2 issues and circularity issues addressed. Now let me just briefly and quickly focus on one major challenge, which a little bit shows what Janez has already said about circular economy is not really competitive at the moment. When we look at plastics and recycling plastics, we have two major barriers in Europe. First one is the fluctuation of the oil price. The oil price determines whether recycled plastics is actually competitive or not. If the oil price is low, then primary plastics are cheap, and the chance for recycled plastics is actually not very high. So one of the major issues is that we have to do CO2 pricing. We have to include the CO2 costs into the pricing of materials. Otherwise, most of the time, the recycled materials, especially also plastics, will always lose on the market. The second one is that the percentage of recycled content, there is no requirement for a percentage of recycled content of plastic as yet. We have the WWPR, which is hopefully adopted next week. But at the moment, also if the WWPR is implemented, this comes only into force in 2030. So we have another 6 years we wait until we have a required percentage of recycled content of plastic packages. And that's a huge problem, because if there is no market for recycled plastics, then there is no investments. And just in 2023, last year, the price of recycled plastics has dropped by 50%. And as a result, many of the recycling plants in Germany are not out of operation because they simply cannot work economically. And we have a lot of SMEs in that area which basically face bankruptcy. And that is, I think, a very alarming state, and we really have to do something about this. So we have to make recycled plastic more competitive. And we also, and that is a statement by the European plastic recycling industry, which has just been published, we have to look also at the imports into the European markets. We have the problem that we have a lot of very cheap virgin plastic, but also recycled plastic, which is labeled as recycled, which is most of the time either low quality recycling material or no recycling material at all. So a lot of the times imported plastics are labeled as recycled plastics, but are in fact virgin plastics. And that is one, and for the finish now, that are really, really serious market conditions which have to be addressed.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you, Martin Vogt. And as maybe you're not aware of what's happening here in Baku, because you're not here present, just joining us virtually, a lot of people were note-taking. So thank you for addressing your priorities and your keynotes. I do see a lot of note-takers here. That's good. Just to give you a little bit of an atmospheric insight. Yes, thumbs up from Baku. Wonderful. Thank you. Alexander Bonde is also with us, as I mentioned. So what we've heard already, integration of circular economy principles within the plastic industry is crucial to enhance environmental protection and nature conservation. Give us again your perspective. Where would you see the potential risks? Shouldn't we be aware of this transition, and shouldn't we not be aware of this inclusion?
Well, I think the biggest risk is underestimating the chances of the topic we are talking about, and I completely agree to what Martin said about the current situation in the plastic markets. But at the same time, we see a lot of potential for new business cases. We see a lot of potential for innovations to really get us closer to a circular use of plastic. And we see a lot of progress in that too at the same time. And the perspective, if you look at the ecological side, is immense. If we look at studies, for example, from the colleagues from the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, they expect that circular economy strategies could lead to a 40% reduction to 2050 in the CO2 emissions. That's not plastics alone, that's the four key materials, that's cement, plastics, aluminum, and steel. But it gives us an impression what really high numbers on CO2 emission reductions we are talking if we go into circular use. And if you look at the side of land use, if you look at water and others, the numbers were mentioned in one of the speeches in the beginning of this meeting are enormous. So I think it's an important task for us to go forward. We have to look at questions of the norms, which are still hindering us. We have to look at the price structure and different other things. But the potential for innovation, the potential for ecological and economic growth are enormous. So we should not take only a look at the challenges, but we should start tackling them. And I'm really happy that this topic reached the COP and that we and others internationally are working on closing the loop.
Yes, thank you, Alexander Bonde, for bringing your perspective here. Nikki Reisch is also with us. When it comes, of course, to bring the journey forward and to make also a business case out of these challenges, we are looking into the perspective, of course, of the companies. So, in fact, how do we hold companies accountable? And that brings me to your perspective from a legal and policy perspective. Bring us a little bit into the role of international law. In what does it play in holding major companies accountable in terms of their plastic pollution and, of course, in their greenhouse gas emissions? What is the pain point here?
Sure. Well, thank you very much for having me. Just first to open with a thanks to Germany and to the Minister for having us up here for this important dialogue. I firmly agree that it's critical to bring the connection between plastics and climate to the fore, because that crucial link, I think, just to pick up on something the Minister said at the opening, is fossil fuels. So 99% of plastics are fossil fuels in another form, and so it's critical to think about how this COP process is actually addressing the production and use of fossil fuels, because we know that is actually driving supply. So we're on the eve of INC-5, as we've been discussing. Many of my colleagues who focus most closely on this issue are en route or soon arriving in Busan. And it's really clear that we need stronger ambition going into this treaty, because the international law has a critical role to play in putting in place a clear and predictable, enforceable set of rules and standards that will address companies' activities across the full life cycle. Because we know that plastics contribute not only to climate impacts, but to other environmental and public health harm, and that is across the entire life cycle. So we need to see, going into this negotiation, a higher level of ambition. What we don't want to see is a repeat of the kind of obstruction and dragging out of these negotiations, or any indication that negotiators are throwing in the towel before we've walked in the door. And what does that mean in terms of the features of an international agreement that could do it? I think sitting here in the COP, we recognize the limitations of an approach modeled after, or that takes after, the Paris Agreement, that depends on voluntary, articulations of plans and pledges without a binding reduction target and required measures. So one thing that's very critical is that we need a legally binding production reduction target and rules that are enforceable. And we need to ensure that those legally binding targets are applied at the national level and become more progressive over time. So a progression in ambition. And we need attention to the subsidies that are going into plastics production and the fossil fuels that it is derived from. We also really critically need to address chemicals of concern. There needs to be a ban on toxic chemicals, both in plastics production and in any circular economy. What we've talked about there, the indications that this issue has been missing from some of the texts that are on the table, is very concerning, because without this attention, we won't be eradicating the critical impacts that this treaty was designed to address. We also critically need to tackle the issue of oversupply. And I think this goes to a point that was made by one of the previous speakers, that unless we tackle the fact that there are too many plastics being produced now, we won't ever make recycled plastics or other alternatives competitive. Because right now we have a capacity expansion that is impeding our ability to reduce the plastic pollution problem and production problem. We also really need to see in this treaty, and it's been on the table and is critical, and there's precedent for that in other multilateral agreements, addressing trade measures. Because if we fail to address the trade in plastic feedstocks and products, it will blow a loophole through this treaty. And we see the potential for doing that. We see that there are precedents for that in other multilateral agreements that address not only restrictions on trade in plastic polymers and other products, including chemicals of concern, but also non-party measures. And I think it's very important to address that. And I'll maybe end just by saying that the governance dimensions of this treaty are critical. We need a robust governance mechanism that is predicated on transparency and traceability to be able to hold companies accountable for their activities and to be able to enforce any binding targets that are put in place. Thank you.
Thank you for your points, Nikki, and thank you for underlining, of course, a lot that still needs to be done, but where we are already. Also, Tsinghua is also with us, and I'd like to come to you as the next speaker when we talk about climate-friendly circular economy practices, and of course the question about where do you see the challenges, the main challenges when it comes to scaling up climate-friendly circular economy practices within the plastic sector, but also not just mentioning the challenges, but also, of course, the solutions and the opportunities and the possible overcomings that you see.
好，非常感谢主持人。
And I
Thank
think
you.
translation devices, yeah.
Thank you very much for the invite. Since 2022, I have been participating in the international negotiations. I'm particularly focused on circular economy and how that is related to plastics and also climate change. So I think indeed this is a very relevant and timely discussion. We know that fundamentally pollution of plastics does not come from the production necessarily, but also improper use and also leaking to the environment. So in this whole process, we need to consider how we can build a closed loop for recycling of plastics. I think this should be something we should pay attention to. Speaking of challenges, how do we link climate change and plastic pollutions? I think we need to consider how we integrate the economy and energy and our resource system, because for the production and consumption of plastics, it's more about the economy, but fighting climate change is more on the energy side. So we need to consider all these parts, what's the different dimensions. We need to find a way to put them all together into one holistic system. So in my personal understanding, I believe that in order to put into place such a circular economy with a closed loop, fundamentally we need to focus on the use and also how we recycle these plastic products. Other speakers talked about how we can incentivize a closed loop of the use of plastics, and I think that's very fascinating. I'd like to share with you 3 points. First, I think we need to develop a proper methodology. In the context of climate change, we need to connect pollution of plastics with this circular economy. We all know that if we recycle and remanufacture plastics products, it can help cut the emissions by some 70 or 80% of its carbon emissions. And in China, we have, with decades of efforts, we have put into place such a recycling system. And every year we can recycle close to 20 million tons of plastics, cutting emissions by 35 million tons of carbon emissions. But now, unfortunately, in the international toolkits, we're not seeing such policy measures, or it is not emphasized enough in our toolkit, circular economy. So I think globally, we need to consider how we can come up with a system with a closed loop, and also how this can be reflected in our NDCs. By developing methodologies such as accounting and circular economy.
I noticed that we're using a glass bottled water here, but however, outside of this pavilion, we can still see plastic water bottles. So recycling of plastic bottles in the world actually are subject to different standards and systems. In Germany and Europe, we are using the extended producer responsibility principle, and to activate such a plastic circular system. So I know that in Germany, 80% of the PET plastic bottles are being recycled. Well, in China, based on our locality, we have built our own system. So right now, our recycle rate has reached 85 or even 90% and above. So on one hand, we have to pay attention to our common goal, that is closing the loop of plastic. However, in terms of pathways and methodologies, I think each country are faced with different systems and conditions. So we might need to find different pathways. Thirdly, surrounding the disposal of recycled plastic. We quite agree we have to incorporate recycled plastic into our carbon emissions market, as previously mentioned by panelists. So we have to set a minimum percentage for recycled material in plastic, which Germany and EU as a whole are paying attention to it. But actually, there are more than that. We need to have a laddered utilization and repurpose of recycled plastic actually cater to the developing countries' needs and conditions. So we have to make sure that plastics are recycled and are prevented from going into nature, water body, and ocean. So we have to make sure we do not create some new green barriers which will sabotage the free trade system globally. So today, under a Sino-German collaboration framework, so we also have experts from the China and US to design a system for plastic. So yesterday we jointly released a research outcome. So I hope that between China and Germany, we can incorporate plastic treatment, circular economy into our future research areas. So I think that as for China, Germany, Europe, together we can promote circular economy and we can start from plastic. We together accounts for 50% of the production and over 50% of recycled plastic. So that will be a new pathway and an entry point for solutions tackling climate change.
Thank you very much, Mr. Tsinghua, for outlining, of course, several things, but among your points also, of course, international collaboration. And that brings me to Liyang, who's also joining us here on the panel. When it comes to working together, when it comes to international collaboration, your view on international collaboration in terms and in our topic of advancing energy conservation and the reduction of emissions, particularly in our context of developing regulations, what we've heard earlier, in designing strategies and frameworks for circular economy practices in plastic value chains. What's your perspective on that in terms of international collaboration and international cooperation?
First of all, I would like to thank Moderator for your question. A well-put question. Listening to the ministers and experts, panelists' view, very insightful, very inspiring. From energy conservation and emission reduction perspective, and how it can be reflected throughout the plastic value chain, how can we insert the circular economy principle to that value chain? So I think it actually is well in line with circular economy. First of all, you need to save resources and improve efficiency. Secondly, in production consumption process, we need to minimize wastes, pollutants. In the meantime, we have to reutilize those wastes. So these are the three principles for circular economies. Energy saving is one aspect of saving resources. So it's aligned with circular economy. And I quite agree with the previous panelist. China has played an important role in treating plastic pollution. In China, circular economy does not only tackle plastic, but also the whole industrial chain. It has a great role in cutting down emissions. According to our estimation, during the 12th to 13th and 14th five-year period, circular economy has contributed 25% of China's emissions reduction, which is a large number. However, still lag behind compared to the EU. The EU's goal is that it needs to reach 48% when it reaches carbon neutrality. Well, by 2060, China will increase this number to 60%. In terms of plastic, as Yao said, between 2016 to 2023, in this span of 8 years, we have recycled 130 million tons of plastic waste, the bulk of which was reutilized. However, it only counts for 30% recycling. But we can reduce the exploration extraction of crude oil. I think we saved 390 million tons of crude oil.
We also talked about how we recycled over 20 million tons of plastics during the previous five-year plan period. So if, say, 1 ton of recycled plastics can help save 2.9 tons of carbon emissions, so in total that is somewhere between 35 million to 50 million tons of emissions. So that's pretty remarkable. And I also agree with Mr. Yao that we also need to step up our management to prevent leaking of these pollutants. So we need to have more strict control. And also in China, we're not just focusing on managing plastics, but also we're finding reliable alternatives to replace plastics using bamboo, because we have lots of bamboo in China. So with the support from the NDRC and other government agencies, we're promoting reliable alternatives to replace plastics. For instance, for the single-use cutlery and others. For instance, in Hainan province, I think they have a total ban on the consumption of single-use plastics. So I think in China, we're also trying to scale up these experiences. Of course, plastics pollution is a challenge, but as has been mentioned earlier, we are the smartest species on the planet. So I believe that we need to trust each other, and developed countries should support. We need to trust each other, and developed countries should support developing countries so that we can work together to reduce pollution from plastics. So there are lots of similarities between Germany and China. Germany is a big manufacturer, and for China, we also have a large manufacturing sector for raw materials. So we have lots of we can complement each other. We can bring different things to the table. And for Germany, you also are doing very well when it comes to circular economy, and lots of things that we can learn from you. I visited Germany first, and I found my trips very inspiring. And also, our colleagues talked about how in Germany, There are some concerns about the value chain because of the price, the low cost of the primary raw materials. So I think we need to step up our regulation. For instance, giving a mandatory requirement for recycling. In China, we're developing this kinds of legislation. Give a mandatory requirement for recycling, and that can help us solve issues on multiple fronts for environment, for emissions, and also for resources. Our two countries need to step up our cooperation in all the segments of developing a circular economy. We are already working with the United States on this front, so we also hope that we can work with Germany to set up another great example. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your perspective. Janez, I'd like to bring in you, of course, and then we still have you as a speaker with your perspective. But Janez, listening to the topic of international collaboration with the INC-5 around the corner, from your perspective, of course, again, you mentioned a lot of to-dos already, but what are the opportunities that will come out of the INC process, and also, of course, that will come out when we work closer together, as we've just listened to the previous speaker?
Yeah, many interesting things were said during this conversation. If I would just point the first one, which was somehow mentioned by Nikki, we should be aware that we are still locked in the fossil fuel economy. According to IMF, direct and indirect fossil fuel subsidies were the highest in 2022, amounting for 1% of global GDP. So it's difficult to talk in Baku how to limit the use of fossil fuels and GHG emissions related to them, and on the other hand, stimulate their use more than ever. When it comes to plastic, I'm on a positive note, I'm actually optimistic, and I will explain you why. If you want to do any change in environmental area, it's critical to have public acceptance. And there are some areas which are very closely seen by the public as problematic, like food waste, but plastic is also belonging to that category. That's why I think it's really important to use that kind of power which is behind the potential change also for changes in reality. You know, as a policymaker, you basically have two options to steer the development. One is trying to fix the market signals, the other is regulation. And our current system does not incentivize sustainable resource use, which was mentioned by Martin. In fact, quite the opposite. We should thus stop signaling producers that extraction-based economic success is most profitable, and avoid also contradictory signals which we are sending to the consumers to behave responsibly, but still routinely pay more if they do so. So to avoid overregulation, which is many times one of the remarks, critical remarks, and rightly so, coming from the business sector, we need to set market signals first in the right direction. Because if we are sending producers and consumers through market in one direction and through regulation in other direction, which we create just a lot of confusion on the markets, a lot of confused producers and consumers, which do not actually know how to behave. Xian Yao also mentioned an important issue, I think, which is very much worth of consideration. Solutions should consider reality of the challenges which different countries, different parts of the world are on the different level of development are facing. So even if this might not belong entirely into the circular economy logic, ensuring controlled disposal of waste, which should of course be simultaneously done also with other upstream circular economy options, it's for some countries critical. I remember that that was even the case in Europe when I was commissioner responsible for environment. So To address this just transition of the informal sector to improve working conditions and to ensure human rights is definitely critical. But for the others to conclude, for more developed part of the world, I think we always have to start by focusing on changing the existing prevailing wasteful system, trying to provide our needs in most resource efficient, least harmful way, using less energy, using less materials, including plastics. So in the first place, focus on the source, including behavioral change, and not on the cleaning up. Without changing the source, it will be just more cleaning up. Yeah. So I think it's critical that we look to that first.
Thank you, Janez, for your perspective. And as the last speaker, I invite, of course, you, Mr. Su, again, in answering the question on the changes that we were debating now. They need, of course, a driving force, and they need a design. So how do we push that change, these policy changes, forward?
Thank you, Moderator. Well, I think there's consensus globally. Developing circular economy is a systemic solution to resource efficiency. I'm really happy to see that at today's meeting, starting from Janez's presentation, at IRP, we have an idea that resource efficiency's improvement is reflected on the triple planetary crisis, which are climate, biodiversity loss, and pollution. So they are the main drivers for these crises. So developing circular economy, improving resource efficiency, we must tackle the main environmental problems, which correspond to the triple planetary crisis. And before I answer the question, it comes to my mind that today we keep talking about circular economy for plastic. Recycling is only one aspect. And it occurs to me, maybe we should start a research topic for certain economy. For every 1% of plastic recycling increase, how much greenhouse gas emissions reduction it can achieve, and how much fossil fuel can be saved, and how much toxic chemicals can be reduced. So once we have this result, of course this is a very difficult research, because behind this 1% improvement, there are technology pathways, economic incentives, and quality issues, etc., etc. But going back to the question, these insights can be translated into what kind of policy recommendation. Earlier, I talked about IRP has a policy framework that invites multi-party involvement. And the most important one is policy mix. So we should let natural resources, environment, climate change, should consider them together, with plastic being one of the example. And lastly, in China, the development of circular economy, and actually in China we have a joint meeting mechanism consists of dozens of ministries and departments, and hosted by the State Council. So speaking of policy, I think policy coordination is really important. And this is why we are hosting today's discussion.
And I know there is so much more to debate. Just to give you a quick overview why I'm pushing a little bit on time, because we have a press conference directly followed up on this event. That's why we are a little bit pushing forward now. Nevertheless, please give our panelists a big round of applause for giving us several perspectives. Janez Potočnik joining us online, Dr. Bing Zhu, Martin Vogt also online, Alexander Bonde, Nikki, Reisch, Liyang, Tsinghua. Thank you very much for being here today. All right, thank you. Last but not least, yes, you can also leave, of course, the stage as we are making room and time and space for the final remarks by the Director General in the Ministry for the Environment, Nature Conservation, Nuclear Safety of Germany. Eva Kracht is also by uns. Eva, what should we all take notes of and what should we debate? This is your room.
Well, thank you very much. It's been a very lively debate, so I've had trouble taking notes of everything that's been said. But I would just like to recall a few things that many of you said. Tsinghua pointed out it's a timely discussion, and Alexander Bonde said the topic has reached the COP. And I can actually confirm we have today's side event. Yesterday, I myself was at a similar side event in the Pavilion of Zimbabwe, and I was informed by Wang Hao, present in the room, that yesterday there was a joint Chinese-US side event on circular economy. And this makes a lot of sense because, among other things, Nikki Reisch pointed out fossil fuels in another form is basically what plastics are. And Janez Potočnik drew our attention to the fact that material resource use accounts for about or more than 55% of global greenhouse gas emissions, 40% of pollution, and over 90% of biodiversity loss. Liyang Zhu explained that circular economy approaches have been instrumental in reducing Chinese emissions by 25% over the last years. So, well, this is the problem described, the links between climate and circular economy and plastics well described. Where does this take us? What do we need to do? Zhu Bing pointed very much to the role of science in all of this. And we need to have a close look at the different plastic streams and differentiate, for example, between long-term sectors and short-term sectors. Tsinghua asked us to close the loop and, what's more, incentivize closing the loop. On a similar note, Martin Vogt called for stable and supporting political framework conditions. As similarly, Janez Potočnik said, we need clear market signals. Some concrete measures to achieve this that have been mentioned include using carbon pricing, carbon markets. Secondly, maybe recycled content requirements. Thirdly, mandatory recycling requirements. Fourthly, promoting reliable alternatives. Fourthly, bans of single-use plastics. And Janez Potočnik also drew our attention to we need to focus on the source, including behavioral change. Numerous speakers said what we need here is policy coordination and a holistic approach to climate policy, economic policy, circular economy, plastics policy. Minister Steffi Lemke pointed to two very important things that need to be done right now. Firstly, we all should include circular economy in NDCs, which has been supported by Tsinghua as well. Secondly, this COP should send a clear message to Busan, to the fifth round of international plastics negotiations. And this was very much echoed by Nikki Reisch. Both of them called for a reduction of plastic production as an important part of the treaty that is being negotiated. Other elements that were mentioned that will be important to be considered in those negotiations in Busan is that developing countries will need support, that we should learn from each other, while at the same time we need to take different realities in different countries into account. Let me conclude by quoting that very nice quote that Janez Potočnik had in his presentation. Let's not waste time in chasing the butterflies. Let's tend our garden. Thank you.
Thank you. Eva Kracht, thank you, Eva Kracht, for summarizing and for bringing us all on the loop again. I wish you another successful day here at COP. Thanks for coming, thanks for joining, and thanks for being here at the German Climate Pavilion.
Welcome to the German Climate Pavilion at COP29 in Baku. Germany. Climate solutions, fast and fair.